Okay, so today we're going to just have a quick intro to the skeletal system and what it's made of and what its functions are. So, if I asked you what the skeletal system was made of, the first thing you would say is probably bones, which is great. But there's so much more to it than that. So let's take a look at some of the other ones. Ligaments and tendons, of course, and the cartilage that you find at the end. So the ligaments hold bone to bone, tendons hold muscle to bone, cartilage is at the ends to decrease the amount of friction. However, you also have blood and blood vessels, you have the joints, you have adipose tissue stored in the bone marrow, and you have nerves in there too. If you've ever broken a leg or an arm or any other bone, you know that there are nerves in there because it hurts a lot. Okay, so functions. The first one is shape and support. Your body is shaped the way it's shaped because of the way your bones are shaped. There's two parts to the skeleton in terms of major divisions. There's the axial skeleton, which you can see is in yellow over in that diagram on the right. So we're talking about skull, vertebrae, and the ribs. Those together make up the axial skeleton. In addition to the axial skeleton, you have what's called the appendicular skeleton, and you have the shoulder girdle, which includes the shoulder blade and the clavicle, which is your collarbone. The pelvic girdle, which consists of three bones fused together called the coxal bone, the arm bones and hand and wrist, and the leg bones and ankle and feet. So those are the two main categories. The second function is protection. Love that skull. And each of the bones comes out. Actually, we might use that because it's really easy to see the different bones. Anyway, it's for protection. So for example, the skull. What does the skull protect? Of course it protects the brain. However, there are other things in there that are critical that your skull also protects, such as your eyes. Now, obviously not from the front, but from the side, the eye socket. Coming directly out of the brain itself are these things called cranial nerves, which include the nerves that allow you to see and hear. So those are protected inside the skull to a degree. And the pituitary gland. When we get to looking at the skull bones, you'll see that there's this beautiful little pocket inside, not inside, but developed or in one of these bones, and it's just where the pituitary gland just sits, and it's just really cool. All right, so we also have the rib cage, which protects, for the most part, the heart and lungs, although up behind some of the lower ribs you might find some liver, you might find some of the kidneys, but for the most part, heart and lungs. And then we have the spinal column, or the vertebrae, and those protect, of course, the spinal cord, and we'll get into that a whole lot more too. Okay, third function. Movement. You can't move unless you have bones. You'd be just a gelatinous mass kind of wiggling on the floor. So bones act as levers, and they give the muscle something to pull on. And so we'll be doing a lab with this kind of stuff in a couple weeks. Another one is hematopoiesis. Love that word, hematopoiesis, which is blood cell production, and that takes place in the bones as well. Growth. So you can see from this, I don't know if it's an x-ray, I don't know, this fetal skeleton, you can see where the red or orangish color is. That's where cartilage has started to be replaced by bone. But all of those places that are just sort of yellowish, it's just cartilage. There's no bone in there at all. So you can see the elbows and the wrists, part of what's in the hand anyway. Then you can see the knee and the ankle and nothing in the toes. There's a little bit happening right here. So this is where you see bone cells taking over where cartilage used to be. Cartilage cells do not turn into bone cells. They are replaced by. Another example of growth is when you have a fracture of a bone. That looks nasty, doesn't it? If you look closely, you can see that this is the knee, because right here is the kneecap. Here is the distal end of the femur. And this is a lateral view, meaning from the side, and this is a posterior view, meaning from the back. So, repairing bone after a break, you also need to have bone growth. Another place where bone growth takes place, though, is in bone remodeling. And you say, what? Why would bones have to change their shape? Well, as you grow, the distribution of weight changes. You may gain weight, you may lose weight, you may build up your muscles, or you may lose muscle mass. So all of those things have an effect on this force, not necessarily compressive force, but the force on the bones. So if you look at this sort of vector diagram, although it's not exactly that, but if you look at these vectors, you can see that most of the force is towards the medial side of, this is a femur, of the femur, and there's very little force out here. So what that's going to make happen is that bone is going to start to be broken down on this side, whereas the force is greater on the medial side, so bone is going to start to be built up over here, and it straightens out the bone again. It's beautiful. It's very cool. It's called Wolff's Law. The next thing the skeletal system does is storage. And I think you would probably say calcium if I asked you, but there's also phosphorus and fat, which you'd find in the bone marrow. So that's number 6. Number 7 is hormone production. And there's a hormone called Phosphate Onin, which regulates phosphate homeostasis, which we'll talk a bit more about soon when we get to, we'll have a couple days on just homeostasis. So hormone production, so Phosphate Onin, but it also produces this stuff called Osteocalcin, which regulates insulin and testosterone production. So there we get the Hulk. Number 8 is calcium homeostasis, and you're not responsible for the diagram. It's just, we'll come back and look at that in some detail. But I do want you to be familiar with the 3 different types of cells that you find in bone tissue. So there's osteocytes. These are mature bone cells. They do whatever bone cells do, carry on regular old daily metabolism. Osteoblasts take calcium out of the blood in order to build up the bone. So blasts build up the bone, and osteoclasts, with the C, release calcium into the blood, which happens when bone is being broken down. So osteoclasts break down the bone. So those are our 8 functions of the skeletal system. We have structure and support, protection, movement, hematopoiesis, growth, storage, hormone production, and calcium homeostasis. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion on skeletal system components and functions. Thanks for listening.